time is just
Okay, looks good.
okay. All right, I'm gonna start. No, not too long. Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a wonderful Tuesday. We want to present to you a new process for the big questions. We've been receiving a lot of feedback, and as always, this course is as much yours as it is ours, and we're open to changing it and fixing problems and adding new challenges along the way. So one of the items was for the big questions, just not enough time in class, so we're going to be moving the big question to the end of class. So I'll present that orally for the last 5 minutes, and then you'll have the opportunity to also work with people nearby to craft your answer to the big question. This will also give you a little more opportunity to dive in greater depth for the big question. And I think there's a minimum of something 2 sentences on the big question. So we just want to encourage thought on that and participation. The other note is we've received really great feedback for your feedback regarding the speakers. So people have been writing in the comments there, and that's great. We love it. Please keep doing that because it really does help the speakers benefit their talks for GDC or the other presentations they're giving. So far, the response has been really positive. Okay, so some notes for CS146. More modules, please. We did have 1 or 2 assignments last week include a module within their project to get some bonus points, but this is an opportunity open to everyone, and it's often pretty quick to kind of take out a piece of your content, a piece of your project to use in later projects, and I think it's going to really help you moving forward to kind of start working on your final project in advance. The other note is we'll be introducing more rigorous grading criterion, such as the playtesting requirement. So I've made it a lot clearer on the assignments, the bullet points that need to be hit within the video submission. So make sure when you're doing your video, even have the bullet point list on the screen while you walk through it, and make sure you're hitting every point. Something like, what did you learn from playtesting? What's your example of dual purpose, or in this case, diegetic design? Make sure you're hitting those points. Notes are that several people have emailed us regarding, hey, is this a good diegetic design? Is this a good diegetic audio? Or does it not count? This is a great question to send us over email or ask in office hours. I don't want anybody to present work and then realize, oh, snap, that's actually not a good diegetic design. So please pass those by us before you present it. Also, be cautious of crunch. This is a big discussion going on right now. I don't know if you follow games industry news, but my friends have been all over Twitter regarding Red Dead Redemption 2 and some talks right now regarding crunch, which is an ongoing discussion, but I want everybody to be conscious of that, and that, you know, when we were serious about the assignment hourly expectations for how much time you should be putting into things. Also, remember to tutorialize your games. There was a lot of games in the demo that didn't have a tutorial. Something as simple as like, oh, you press the space bar to shoot. That might not be intuitive for some players, so there should be some sort of tutorialization mechanic so that they can understand. Another note is indiegamejams.com. A lot of the games which you guys are creating do fit within the criterion for an indie game jam, and I would consider submitting to one of these competitions. You might win something with your assignment project. For assignment 5, we're going to be creating teams manually. Instead of through the Google form, we've instead created this Google Sheets document, which you could go in and edit directly. So we ask for you to do that. We'll also touch upon this next Thursday, but if you want to get a head start, tinyurl.com/CS146 groups. That's where you can do that. And the link is also on the website. All right, now we're going to present our diamonds for the last assignment.
Okay, so I really like the one on the bottom, which is Battle Balls. I felt like this group did a really good job of building their game really around the dual mechanic they came up with, and not maybe making a game they already wanted to make that was really nice and thinking of it as an afterthought. Specifically in this game, these are both real players, and you throw the ball, which either turns a territory into, like, you conquer that territory, and if the other player runs into it, they die, or if you hit them with the ball, they die. The dual mechanic was that when you throw, you have to stop, and then also, obviously, you're trying to hit the other player. I felt like it really forced you to strategize in terms of whether you're trying to, like, force the other person to move somewhere, or if you want to, like, just try to hit them directly. And it was also just a lot of fun to play in general, so they did a really good job. And Angelo, are you doing another one, or someone?
Great, so now we're going to run through some brief case studies in video game art direction. Art direction it can be so impactful in work. I think right now a lot of people are looking at Lucas Pope's new game, The Return of the Obra Dinn, which is smashing charts, right? It just came out like 2 days ago. And this is an art direction that's been honed over years. We saw his GDC talk, I think over 2 years ago, right? And so I think it's a testament to how impactful the design choices, visual design choices can be in crafting your game's experience and game feel. So one example which you may not be familiar with is silhouette design. So the idea here is that when you're designing your characters, you take out all the detail except for the silhouette, and through that you explore who the character is. And this is really important within the hero shooter, where a lot of these examples are from, just because the player needs to be able to immediately recognize what that character does by just their shape alone. So maybe we could do a little test here. I don't know if people play Overwatch in the audience, but maybe do you know, is this working? Does anybody know who this character is? McCree. Yeah, like, you can pretty much do it in a second, right? And it's designed that way. So it's a very conscious decision to be able to identify a character. I have an example here from a game that didn't do as well, and I think one of the problems may have come from the lack of diversification within the player types. So by that I mean it's very different to maybe look at the screen very quickly and be able to tell people apart. In fact, that's one of the first steps that happened in Rainbow Six Siege. Rainbow Six Siege is an interesting game to study because it came out to very poor reviews, and now it's really soared in the charts. And one of the big differences that they made was if you look in the top left, this was what the game looked like originally, and all the characters are pretty normalized. They all look kind of like military men. But in the bottom left, which is what the lineup looks like now, it's a much more diversified group. Not only in the countries they come from, in this sort of cultural diversity, but also in just their silhouettes alone, how they look. I think the bottom right's a fun example because everybody in this picture is wearing gas masks, yet the creative direction, the art direction was able to hone it in such a way that literally everyone has a different kind of gas mask. So maybe a little silly how minuscule the details are, but they do add up. Here in the book Significant Zero, Walt Williams talks about how player affordance can really impact the player experience. So in this book, the whole idea is that he's kind of a loser, okay? He's a zero. But the idea is that in a bigger team, a zero can have a huge impact, right? Just the idea of maybe a zero in a number sense, when paired with the one, now it's not a zero anymore, it can make that one into a 10. So he can have a significant impact even if he is a loser. And so the fight that he has with Ken Levine is that you can use this power which will turn people to freeze, and if they freeze into these little ice cubes, he says, you should be able to telekinetic grab them, which is another power in the game. However, the player couldn't, and this caused some ludonarrative dissonance. So it's an interesting question when players in your game are trying to do something that they're not allowed to. And it's one that game developers pretty often face. Here's a brief example from Skyrim, where it's the case that you cannot kill children. So this was actually a legal concern, because you're not allowed to kill kids in video games in some countries. And what they ultimately decided was that if you go and you stab this poor guy, Samuel, nothing's going to happen, okay? He's invincible. And that may have been the only legal route they could have taken. But what does this cause, right? Huge ludonarrative dissonance. Why is this kid invincible? He's more powerful than the Dovahkiin. There are other ways in which this same problem was solved, though. Let me give you an example from Far Cry 2. So the designer of Far Cry 2 was very deliberate in his design choice that he does not want players to kill animals for fun. He felt very deeply about this decision and decided to design the game around this choice. What his ultimate decision was is that he wanted to make killing animals as unfun as possible. And he believed that if he did this, if he made killing animals boring, players wouldn't be driven to do it. The solution, and I looked this up over the weekend, was incredible. This was a post from someone on an online forum, and what they say is, I've shot some of the animals before and even used my machete on them a few times. The death animations aren't that great for animals, they just kind of lie down. So it's exactly what the designer intended. This sick astral machine guy was taking out his machete and literally trying to knife these poor deer, and he was like, oh, you know what, it's not fun. Let me put my machete away, right? So literally, the choice of direction in this game was able to change the player narrative and to change the player experience in a way that they wanted it to. In other cases, players might not understand what they can do. So in these two examples from the games The Witness and Subnautica, I was faced as a player with affordances I didn't realize I had. So in both of these games, I played through for hours without realizing I could do certain things. In the case of The Witness, they have hidden these audio logs, which I played through the game not realizing they were present. I had seen these, and on the screen it's very small. It's very small in the game, but basically this little dot, the pillow, can't interact with it. The pamphlet over here, you can't interact with it. But the little tiny audio log, if you click it, you'll actually hear some audio. And unfortunately, as a player, I never realized this was an affordance, and I never got to experience that part of the game. The same thing happened in Subnautica, where another poor design decision was, I went up to this little box, this little crate underwater, and I interacted with it, I shot it, but I wasn't able to open it. And I didn't realize I had to use a very specific scanner tool on this object to get it to work. So, we're going to look at some ways in which these designers could have used certain methodologies to make it more clear to the player what the affordances are. One really effective design pattern is color. So in Downwall, they use color to very clearly illustrate whether or not you can land on an enemy or how you can land on a certain space, and it's used to great effect. Another option is iconography. So Modern Warfare 2 does a really good job of this by showing you in the bottom left, the bottom right, exactly what kinds of grenades you have. So I can see very clearly there I have 2 yellow stun grenades and a sticky grenade on the right there. It also gives me an idea of how much ammo I have left because it retains the full capacity counter, and I can see these little lines on the bottom right slowly ticking away. So I have a quick idea of what's going on. Another idea is minimalism. So Portal does a really good job of just narrowing down the elements within its game to what's barely essential to understand the problem. And they also have a really good example of using industrial design here of this sort of exit sign, which is literally the exit for the game. So it's a nice nod to brutalism. Another moment is surfacing affordances. So this is pretty simple. When you're in the game Fallout and you go to a door you can open or you can picklock, it has a little display there of text which says, hey, you want to open this door? Just press E. Okay, something very simple like that can actually be a big deal. In this point-and-click adventure game, Detective Grimoire, again, very subtle change. They changed the icon of the mouse if you're hovering over something that's considered a hotspot, something you can interact with. So the mouse turns from a little black mouse like I have to a little hand. And something as simple like this can actually do a huge, it can do a lot of work in explaining to the player how to interact with the world. Okay, that's all I have for you today, and now we'll have an introduction to our speaker.
All right, so today our speaker is Lee Petty. He's the art director and project lead at Double Fine Productions. He's worked in games for 20 years, and additionally, he is on the advisory board for GDC, and he speaks at schools all around the world. Today he's going to talk about art direction. Thanks. Just one moment.
You're plugged into the VGAs?
There it goes. It was just loose. Wow. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the intro. I am Lee Petty. There's a great picture of me. And I do work at Double Fine Productions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Double Fine, but we're an independent game studio located in San Francisco, and it's about 18 years old. I've worked there for about 11 years, and our studio was founded by Tim Schafer, who's best known for his LucasArts games like Secret of Monkey Island, Day of the Tentacle, Grim Fandango, Full Throttle, all those games. And Double Fine's first game was Psychonauts, which came out in 2005. Now, when I started, my first job was working on a game called Brutal Legend, and I was the art director on that project. And it was an open-world heavy metal action game with RTS elements. Jack Black voiced the main character. We had a lot of well-known heavy metal music stars in the game, both doing voices and providing music, like Ozzy Osbourne. And that was a very big game to make, with a relatively small
studio. And after that, we sort of shifted away from doing big AAA games and instead decided to do smaller, multiple smaller games. And that was sort of in time with digital distribution. This sounds like ancient history, right? This is like 5 years ago. So that was sort of like in time with digital distribution becoming a big thing, and I had an opportunity to lead my first project as a creative director, and that game was Stacking, which was a game set in a world of living Russian nesting dolls, where you would stack into dolls and use their abilities to solve adventure game style puzzles. And something that we also do as a studio is public game jams. So we do something called Amnesia Fortnight, which is for 2 weeks, we take people off whatever projects they're working on in the studio, and we make new teams, and we try to make a complete experience in 2 weeks. The interesting thing about this is now a public event, so people can, it's run through Humble Bundle, so people can join in, and they get to vote on which games they want to see. The whole thing is documented, and then at the end of the 2 weeks, you get to play the games on Steam. So this image here is from a 2012 game that I led called Autonomous, which was inspired by VR, like 90s VR, not like current VR. And it was a procedural world where you kind of found these strange parts and assembled robots, and you could program them by throwing switches and get them to do your bidding. This actually was shipped on the Leap Motion device, which probably no one's ever heard of, but it's sort of a motion control device where you use your hands to manipulate the game instead of using a keyboard and mouse. And then for us, we shifted models again, business models again, and went with crowdfunding. And when Kickstarter was first kind of becoming a thing, we went for this game that later on became known as Broken Age. We pitched it as Double Fun Adventure. And the idea there was that we were going to make an old school adventure game, and we were going to document the entire process. All the behind the scenes were going to be filmed, and we did this for about 3 years, and all of those episodes of the documentary are now free. They're up on YouTube if you want to watch them. It's like 28 episodes of people being really stressed and swearing and wondering how we're going to finish it, which is just pretty much normal game development. But I was the art director on that project as well. And then in 2016, I led another game, was shipped in 2016, and it was called Headlander, and it was a side-scrolling action-adventure game, kind of a Metroidvania, if you're familiar with that genre, where it was inspired by 70s science fiction, and you played the last living human being in the galaxy, but you were just ahead. And I did that with Adult Swim. So I want to talk about art direction today, but I'm going to spend just a couple more minutes talking about my background, not because it's that exciting, really, but because you're in school, and some of you may want to actually join the game industry. So everyone I talk to has a very different route of how they got in the game industry, so I'm just going to kind of go over a little bit of my background really quickly in case it's helpful. Since I'm 900 years old, in the 70s, this was my first game system. My dad brought one of these back in the late 70s, and it was, the Atari 2600. And it was an amazing game system. But for me, it really led to my interest in computing, and then later on, I was fortunate enough to get one of these. I didn't have all those cool peripherals. I just had the core unit, and it was the Atari 800. And this thing was like 500 pounds. It had 2 cartridge slots. But the cool thing was I actually learned programming on it because you could get a basic programming cartridge and put it in it, and it had additional 16K, I think, in addition to the 48K of the system. So you could learn basic programming. When I grew up with that computer, and later went on to Atari ST and Amiga, and wound up on the PC. And when it came time to go to college, I kind of had an interest in art growing up the whole time, and I had an interest in writing, and I had interest in computers. I wasn't sure which one I wanted to do, so I chose the most financially viable one, which was art, right? So I went to San Jose State, and these are some of the little goofy drawings I did when I first went to college. I was 17 when I attended San Jose State, and I graduated with a degree in painting and drawing, and I sort of forgot about computers and video games and all that. When I graduated, I was trying to figure out what was I going to do to actually pay for my apartment. And a friend of mine had started working at a company that was riding the wave of the future at the time, which was the magic of CD-ROMs. Right? So CD-ROMs had just come out, and we were working on a company at a company that did digital comic books. And I worked on this really unfortunately named game, Reflux. And this game was about you could imagine a comic book where if you clicked on the panels, it crossfade to full motion video. And full motion video at the time was defined as 12 frames a second at 120 by 90. So it was very small and crappy. And the video footage, of course, we didn't have enough money to actually make our own movies, so we licensed movies from Shanghai at the time, which were quite cheap, these martial arts films. So we designed this, what would later become basically the storyline of The Matrix, as it turns out. But you basically played this character who could jack into the metaverse, it was very Snow Crash-like, and get into these crazy martial arts battles. And you know, that was not really a video game, but it kind of got me really interested in combining my art and my art skills and growing up in computers. And I got my first job at a video game company in San Jose named Accolade, which no longer exists, but they were a publisher and a developer in the 90s, and they're probably best known for Hardball, Star Control, Jack Nicklaus Golf, things like that. And my first game I worked on was Star Control 4, which became known as StarCon during development, and was canceled at Alpha. So imagine this is your first game, you get a job, you work on it for a year and a half, you get to Alpha, and the studio decides, nope, we're canceling it, we're not going to do it anymore. And it was really heartbreaking. But I said, well, there's this other game, I'll go into this other game. That game was also canceled, so I was like a curse for a while. But I like to think that I learned a lot because I got to see all the mistakes that can be made on a game and learn a little bit about what not to do. And even though I had no interest at the time in being a project leader, I just wanted to make art, I learned those lessons and I became very organized and very good at process and workflow because of that. And eventually I did ship some games before I left Accolade. Here's a few of them. And then I went to work, Accolade closed down because it was purchased by a larger company, which of course this happens all the time in tech. And a bunch of colleagues and myself decided to spin off and form our own game company. So we formed a game company in around 2000 named Circus Freak Studios, which, by the way, is a terrible name if you ever want to get money from people. It does not sound very trustworthy. And we made this game, Superman, Man of Steel for the Xbox, the first Xbox. And Superman is a really terrible game to make because it's very hard to make. It comes with a lot of limitations, both from the license, and it's just really tricky because I always phrase it as no player really wants to be Superman, they just want his powers, right? Everyone wants the powers of a god and not his like 1950s Ward Cleaver mentality. So, you know, it was really difficult to make this game, especially with such a small team, but we invested all of our tech as a studio in Xbox. We thought that was going to be the thing. Well, it turned out that PS2 came out and destroyed the Xbox. So we went out of business because no one wanted to hire Xbox developers during that year. And I went to work for a game company called Crystal Dynamics, which is still around in Redwood Shores, and they're probably best known nowadays for making Tomb Raider games. But when I was there, I worked on a couple of games, one of which was called Whiplash, where you played an indestructible rabbit chained to a crazy weasel, of course. And then I worked on a game that became known as Project Snowblind, but it was originally Deus Ex Clan Wars, and that was why I went to the studio, because Deus Ex is one of my all-time favorite games. I was like, I'm going to get to work on a Deus Ex game. This is going to be great. And then Deus Ex 2 came out while I was working on Deus Ex Clan Wars, and it bombed. It did really badly in the marketplace, so marketing said, we need you guys to change what this game is in a few months and then ship it. Right? So we were most of the way done through the project. We had to completely swap the art around, change the story, move the levels around, and it became this very generic cyberpunk war-themed shooter, which of course all the press knew was supposed to be Deus Ex, so it didn't go too well. And then I left that company and went to Double Fine, which I talked about a bit. So the biggest lesson I'd say is make sure you work at an awesome company like Double Fine. And it did well. So that's my brief chaotic history through games. I think if you talk to most other people who've been in games, you'll hear similar chaotic stories. But like I said, I'm an art director and a project lead, and today I want to talk about art direction more than project leadership. And the first question probably is, what exactly does an art director do? And I think there's no agreement from studio to studio. You'll probably talk to different art directors with very different skills, but I like to break it down into three main areas. So there's management, look development, and what I call technical know-how. Not all art directors do those. Some don't manage, some don't have any technical acumen, some are just concept artists. But I think that all three are important to do the job right. I think if you're not doing all three, you're not doing as good a job as you could be. And so if you're not a manager, that's fine. But games are collaborative, as I'm sure you've already realized, and you have to have great communication skills, good collaborative skills. Games are rarely made by one person, and you have to know how to work with other people. So that is really important for an art director because you're directing a lot of the art. You're not creating it all yourself. And look development is what I'm going to talk a lot about today, which is the art of using art direction techniques to create a visual style for your game. And people with that skill set tend to come from traditional art backgrounds, but not always. Sometimes they can come from very technical backgrounds. We saw Lucas Pope's game up there earlier. He was a tools programmer, right? But obviously has a really sharp sense of visual style. And then lastly, technical acumen is important. And that doesn't mean that I write code, or I have written bad code, or that I write lots of workflow scripts, but I do understand the medium I work in. And I think as an artist or an art director, if your interest ends at a piece of paper or your Photoshop file, then you're not doing your job right. You should be invested in what the game is that you're making and understand how to leverage the video game medium. I mean, everyone on your team, regardless of their exact job. And so I think that requires a certain level of technical awareness and how games are put together. You guys are probably all in school for this, so you're like, yeah, of course. But that's not true for everyone you wind up working with. So I want to talk about art direction, and I'm going to tell you what I think art direction is, and I'm going to tell you why it's important for your games. I think sometimes people don't understand what art direction is versus graphics. They're different. I'm going to tell you my approach for that, and I want to give you a framework for talking about visual style, ways of thinking about it, and then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks that I use when I'm building a visual style that you can apply to smaller games. I do want to say that I know that a lot of you are from different backgrounds. You probably all don't have a visual background. Maybe none of you do. And I'm not going to go super deep into art techniques. I'm not going to talk about how to texture a character or how to light a scene. Rather, I'm going to try and just talk about art direction thinking and try and give you some tools and ways of thinking so that when you're working on your games, if the look isn't what you want it to be or if something's not working, you could maybe approach it with some of these ideas and see if you could improve it. So first of all is what is art direction? Other than the job, art direction is, I like the definition that it's the lens through which all of your game's visuals will be realized. It's the sort of process you use to create the visual style. And a visual style's goal, among other things, is to make it all look cohesive, make it look like it's made by, well, maybe one person, but like a group of people, and that the world feels complete. It doesn't feel like a bunch of random ideas thrown together. So the idea is that you are going to make choices of what to include and what not to include, and both of those will create your visual style. We look at Limbo. This is an older game, but I still like using this one as an example of a striking art direction. Their game is just as much about what they didn't include as what they did visually. Obviously, they didn't include color, but that's really not what the style is about. The style is about silhouette. We mentioned silhouette earlier. It's about, you can't see the internal detail. It's all just shape. And that let them focus on atmosphere and mood because you weren't distracted by internal details. And they spent a lot of effort and a lot of subtle things to incorporate some very clever lighting and fog treatments. And the game is super moody. And Playdead, the company that made it, also made Inside, which came out a few years ago. And you can see similar sensibilities. And even though they made the camera more dynamic and added color, they still focused on that sort of moodiness and atmosphere and primarily on shapes instead of internal details. Now, all the time, I hear, or I have heard in my career that, like, man, art is bad, right? Like, art in video games is bad. Design is king, and art is distracting. It ruins iteration. And why do we care? And there's some truth to that, right? Like, if you go after incredibly high-fidelity art, it is going to limit your iteration. But art direction and art style is not the same as visual fidelity. Visual fidelity is, really high-res assets, things you spend a ton of money to make, and art direction is about style. So if we look at something like The Division, there is style to this game, or there is art direction at work there, but primarily when I look at that, I'm like, holy shit, how much did that cost to make, right? Like every little thing in the street is well textured. Imagine a whole city of that. Imagine a whole bunch of people all made to that level of fidelity. That is going to definitely limit your ability to iterate on that game. But if you look at Kentucky Route Zero, that is not a game that most people describe as high fidelity. But it's beautiful. I think it has very strong art direction. You'll see that they've primarily focused, again, on silhouette. They have a minimal color palette. You'll see about 3 colors there. I'm going to bring this up a lot. 3 colors. It's going to come back. There's about 3 colors they're using. And, but it's very striking. It's a very strong set of choices that they've made, and the game is very memorable visually. Now, speaking of which, why is art direction important? Why do you care? What can it do for your game that's different than what design and writing and programming can do for your game? Well, first is something that I like to call identity, which is, if you're making a game, you don't want it to look like everyone else's game. Even if you're making a game in the same genre, you want it to be memorable. You want people to look at a single screenshot of your game and instantly know that it's your game and not someone else's game, right? And I can think of no better game that's done this recently than Cuphead. Maybe Oprah did, but that just came out. Cuphead is a game that is inspired by sort of early 1920-ish, 30s 2D animation, and it's very distinctive. Every time I see a screenshot of this game, I know exactly what game it is. It's a very strong identity. As another great example for identity, and this is a little outside games, we're going to go to death metal, because I like to put death metal in every talk. This is the Death Fest 2 from the Bay Area, and you'll notice that someone decided that their death metal logo was going to be party candy. And the great thing about this logo is it's probably actually not a good death metal logo, but if you saw this giant lineup, you'd remember one name off here. And it wasn't just because it's color, it's not just because the name, it's all those things coming together. It had strong identity. Let's look at some AAA shooters. These are all different games. I couldn't tell you which games these are. They may have done this intentionally. It's not like the artists who work on those games don't know what they're doing. They're probably catering what they believe to be a very specific audience look, but still, these have poor identity. These are very difficult to tell from one another. If I select a group of indie games, and even though 5 out of 6 of these have the same camera style presentation, which is sort of a side scroller, they look very, very different from one another. And those games all have much stronger identity. You're going to be able to tell what those games are right away. So this one is a pill, which is you've got a game that stands out, but you also want it to have appeal. And now look is subjective. Not everyone's going to like the same art direction. And I don't really think you should chase what everyone likes. I think focus group studies that tell you what everyone finds appealing are largely not useful. I think, though, that people do have a desire to try and connect to things through beauty. And the goal of a visual style should have some level of appeal, even if it is a dystopian topic, I believe. People should want to come into your world or games. And if we look at something like Ori and the Blind Forest, you may not like this art style, but it's super inviting. These characters look like they have a story to tell. It looks like that's a world that I want to explore, even if that particular style isn't my favorite. But it's not just indie games that do that well. I mean, Mirror's Edge was another game that came out a little while ago that I thought had a very appealing style. And it was a dystopian world, right? But I wanted to explore that world. It really drew me in through its set of visual choices. I think one of the most important things that art direction can do for your game is readability. This is obviously very important for game design, but one of the primary vehicles for that is the visual style, in addition to things like affordances, which your professor mentioned earlier. So readability is simply just the arrangement of things on the screen, colors and forms, that lead the eye and help the player understand what things are. If we look at Monument Valley, it's a beautiful game. It has very good readability, and this probably is also due to the fact that it was designed for the phone originally, and that's a small screen, so people tend to push for better readability on such a small screen. But you can tell right away what the foreground and background is. You can get a little closer. You can sort of see which areas are walkable and not walkable. And they're doing this through color and value, and also player affordances. And even though a lot of their game is about not knowing where to go for a second or two, they have very clear visuals that tell you that, and you figure the puzzles out, and it's very satisfying. Now we can contrast this to Gears of War 3. Right? I like to pick on shooters, I guess. This is not entirely fair to this product. Not all of the game looks like this, but I did stumble upon the screenshot, and I was like, what is going on here, right? You have a very difficult time telling foreground, background, midground, telling what you're supposed to be shooting, telling who you are. You can see your health bar in the back of your, or your glow bar in the back of your armor, but it's really got poor readability. Mad World, I love these guys, but this is not good readability either. It's a little clearer when it's moving, and I'm sure they're aware of this. I'm sure they're like, readability. Not every game's going to be the best at readability. Maybe that's part of their aesthetic. This is nuts. It's really hard to tell what's going on here. And black and white's more challenging, but let me show you some traditional art, right? Well, semi-traditional. We've got Franklin Booth on the right and Mike Mignola, Comic Press on the left. He's using black and white too. They're both using black and white. These are much clearer examples of how to carve out readability. Again, it's simpler in a 2D image, but you can do it. There are ways to use these techniques. Theme. So the theme of your game is communicated through a lot of different things. gameplay, direct narration, but also the visuals. And the advantage that visuals have over those other things is that they communicate right away. As soon as you see an image, if it has a strong theme, you can communicate those ideas much quicker than you can with mechanics and story. So if we look at a game like Journey, this single screenshot tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the game, right? It is about Journey. It's about exploration. It's about this vast landscape. You can see your goal at the end, right? The end of the life cycle. It's there glowing. It's always present. Your character doesn't even have arms, right? It's already telling you that it's not really going to be about interaction or picking up and throwing things. It's about movement. It's about flowing roads. It's about flow. And when you play it with another person, this screenshot tells you everything you know about that, right? It's about finding another person on this journey and working together. The fact that they have basically the same outfit as opposed to everyone has a random user-created outfit means that there's a harmony between those characters on the screen. And still, their destination is there on the screen. This is just done through visuals. So usually what happens is when you start working on a visual style with your team, you start talking to people, you're trying to find ways to talk about it, and someone goes, well, I don't like cartoony, but I'm into hyper-real, or something like that. And you're like, what does hyper-real mean? What does cartoony mean, right? And there isn't really a good common language for describing art direction and visual style. So I have a framework. I have many frameworks that I use, and I'm going to share one today that I think is useful because it kind of talks about the different aspects of a look, and it might help you kind of break down what you want your game to look like in a little bit more detail than just saying cartoon. So they're the 4 Fs. Everyone remember that, right? So we've got frame, form, focus, and filter. And each of these are sort of pillars, if you want, visual pillars for your art style. And they overlap a bit. They're not so completely cleanly divided, but I want to describe how you can use each of these to help carve out a look for your game. So first is frame, and frame is pretty simple. It's just the when and where of your game. Like, where does it take place? What's the time frame? And even though that's not directly related to, or not directly correlated to your visual style, it can have a big influence. So if we look at a game like LA Noire, well, now they've said that the game takes place in Los Angeles in 1947, right? And that era means that the graphic design that you're seeing, the cars on the street, there's not even any people in the screenshot, and that would further cement it. But that is influencing the style, their color choices, their graphic design, all that. Here's a photo of what LA actually looks in that time. With a lot more cars, just like today. But they managed to evoke that, but then stylize it in their own way. Even for games that are a little more abstract, going back to one of my favorite games, Kentucky Route Zero, this is a magic realist game. It's not entirely cogent. It doesn't really have a specific time frame as far as I know, but you can tell based on the sort of dress and the style of that TV and the truck, and there are some other clues that, hey, maybe this is taking place in the late 20s. A lot of these themes are about the Great Depression, and there's some photos here that show some of those similarities. So decide that, even if your game is very abstract, say, well, where is it taking place? Where is it? We were working on Psychonauts 2 right now at Double Fine, and when this team started, they were asking for some advice on art direction, and I was like, well, when does it take place? And they're like, I don't know, when did the first one take place? And only Tim knew, right? But they needed some telephones in the office. They're like, well, what are those telephones going to look like? Well, you know, you can stylize them, but if your game takes place in 1983, it's going to be a different type of telephone. And second is form. The second F is form. And we touched on this a little bit earlier. And this is when you talk to artists, they mainly play in this arena. They're really obsessed with form. And so I use form to just talk about, you know, are your proportions realistic? Are they exaggerated? Are your colors naturalistic? Are they impressionistic? Those sorts of things. If we look at this game, second time this has come up today, right? This is Team Fortress, right? And they went for a high degree of readability for obvious reasons, for a shooter class-based game. But they actually drew a lot of their style from the golden age of illustration. So they have said that they drew a lot of their inspiration from this illustrator, J.C. Leyendecker. And if you look at those two images, you might not at first glance see a lot of similarity there. But if you kind of keep looking at them, you can see that there's an emphasis on sharp silhouette. And you can see that there's a relatively minimal amount of color. Each given area isn't overly shaded. And you wind up with a very readable graphic shape in both cases. And they extended that over to their environments, right, which also help readability and playability. But you can see that that rock isn't naturalistic at all. That rock kind of looks like a character, right? And those other shapes are simple enough to kind of give you a sense of place, but they don't distract from the characters and the action going on. Third is focus. Focus is what do you care about most visually in your game? What is your game trying to say about its visuals? Where do you want to put all of your effort? You only have so much time. You can't make everything amazing, right? What's going to be the most amazing thing? One of my favorite games is Shadow of the Colossus. And for me, the focus of this game is about scale, right? It's certainly not just the scale between the character and the Colossus. That's obviously driven by the gameplay, right? You're climbing these things and defeating them. But they go out of their way to draw attention to that with their camera system. When you're moving around, it's not the most playable camera in the world, but you really have this sense that you're alone in this world. The world is vast and somewhat empty. They didn't really even put much stuff to find in the world. And this giant beast that you're tackling is there. And they extend this idea and their visuals over to every part of the game. Even when they have a shot like this, where you're in an interior, some people might be like, okay, let's ramp up the graphic detail in the interior so people think we're AAA, and then we'll go outside and you can do your game design thing. But in here, they went, no, we're staying with this, right? This is a cathedral. It's empty, right? The tall, long, vertical lines to emphasize how small the characters are. And what's on view outside the window? Basically nothing. It's a big open landscape. That was their focus. Now, filter is a little bit of a tricky one, but also kind of one of the most interesting. And filter is just how are you processing your visuals? Like, is there a special lens? Are you seeing them through like the eyes of a crazy person, or this is what looks like if Francis Bacon made a video game, it looked like this, which is maybe the same as a crazy person. But, or a lot of times these are associated with technical limitations. Like, oh, I want to be like if we made an 8-bit game today, or a game with no Z buffer, it kind of look like this, or we're going to imitate a CRT emulation. You can look at games like Hotline Miami, right? They obviously are evoking an earlier era of video games. You debate whether it's 8 or 16-bit. But they also have this 80s aesthetic with their color choices, and they also have a VHS aesthetic that's going on there. If you play these games, there's a lot of magnetic distortion and scan lines and stuff that are evocative of that era. And you can see the very sort of crudely drawn characters support that. Child of Light is another game that has a filter. It's a very different filter compared to Hotline Miami. They were trying to really evoke storybook, fairy tales, and they did that through a couple of ways, one of which, of course, is just the themes and the character design of the game, but they also really went down on the watercolor path. You look really closely, like in some of their dialogue sequences, you can see that they went out of their way to imitate like watercolor paper as a texture. You have some of the imperfections of painting with watercolors. Even the way the text is put onto the page with all white around it is evocative of reading a storybook and not a video game where you tend to have a lot of very busy dialogue boxes. So what I want to do is step through a couple of commercially released games and tell you how I would interpret their visuals or describe them according to this sort of framework. So we're going to start with Fallout 3. Again, the second time, it's almost like we coordinated. We didn't. Came up today, and is another one of my favorite games. So the frame of Fallout 3 is it's a future apocalyptic world, right? We don't know exactly the time, well, depending on the game. But it's in the future, and it's an apocalypse. We know it's in America. We know it's made by Bethesda, and there's a lot of East Coast stuff in there, right? So their form is pretty realistic in terms of the proportions of their buildings, but they've really gone for a really limited palette, almost like 3 colors. I'll keep mentioning that. And they chose this really sickly green palette that makes most people feel uncomfortable because they're trying. The world is poisoned. It's kind of a hopeless game in some ways. But what's interesting about their form is if you look at their characters from Fallout 3, they actually shifted their form and their sensibilities quite a bit. They went with a more, I would describe it as comic book proportions and colors and things. Now, I think part of that was for readability. You having these highly saturated characters with simpler silhouettes will read against all this sort of noisy background. But I think also it's a little bit of an emotional step back. It's like a half step back from some of the like really, it's like The Road. It's really terrible. But there's like a little half step back, and you're like, oh, this guy's kind of goofy. He's yellow, kind of scary, but kind of stupid, And that was, I think, was very intentional on their part. Then their focus is on open world stuff. Like this, my interpretation of the focus on this is that every time you walk in this game, there's always a landmark. There's always something to see. You always feel like you can just wander into any corner of the world, and the visuals are all built to support that. There's actually a lot of literal freeways leading you around. and there's always things poking up, and there's never a place that you can see that you can't go for the most part in that game. Now, their filter is really interesting because on the one hand, their frame is set in the future, but their apocalypse took place in the 50s sometime. So they have all this sort of 50s Americana as their filter. Everything is kind of seen through this Cold War lens, down to your Pip-Boy, which is a lot of your interface. But it's the logo, it's the overall look of it, looks like it could have been made in the 50s, but it's also got this goofy sensibility with the Pip-Boy himself. And you see signs like this where describing the character's abilities and perks as if it was a child's storybook, and these sort of, post-war buy a house in suburbia posters. And again, I feel like that's done to kind of take a slight step back from the otherwise really terrible tone of the game. But it informs a lot of the style. And in fact, I think this filter is actually, for me, way more memorable. I think about the things that made me smile or the interface elements I remember. It's this stuff. I ran into like a Martin Van Buren robot at one point. It's like, it's crazy Americana stuff, right? And one more game I want to go through this process with, because it's a very different type of game, is Guacamelee. And the second one just came out. You guys have played these games, but they're great. It's a side-scrolling action melee game, and it takes place in a small Mexican town. I don't think they're ever specific on the era, but you can sort of tell by looking at it that when you play the game, there's no cars, there's not any advanced technology. It feels kind of, to me, like maybe early 20th century, late 19th century. Now their form, they went after a very strong, simple graphic shapes. And it reminds me a lot of the Tartakovsky animations, like Samurai Jack. Those are really great for action readability and really memorable. And that's where they put a lot of their not their focus, but a lot of their form energy. For their focus, they have this mechanic where it's a living world and a dead world, and you can switch between the two. But they put a lot of visual effort into that. It's not just a gameplay mechanic, because you can see that they basically switch out a significant chunk of the art whenever you do that. Some of the characters change appearances. The palette goes from kind of a warmer, more naturalistic approach on the left to a more surreal, verdant color scheme on the right. And their filter is the whole game is kind of seen through the lens with Mexican folklore. There's a lot of references to the Day of the Dead and a lot of this sort of Aztec, Mayan sort of ruins in there. However, they also have an additional filter of wrestling, and it's not just the fact that the main character is a luchador. Whenever you go to fight a boss in that game, they actually frame the beginning of the boss fight as if it was a wrestling poster. So they really kind of double down on that as well. So I want to talk next about some tips and tricks for building your visual style, but before I do that, I'm going to take some questions, because your instructors asked me to pause for about 5 minutes and see if you guys have any questions. At this point, we'll have some more time at the end as well. So, question? There's no microphone here, so I guess you just yell it out. Raise hand. Someone's got to have a question. Yes, you. I knew it. I could tell by looking in your eyes.
Well, hold on, because this is not the best question ever. What was that game with that cup where you play?
Cuphead.
It's called what?
Cuphead.
Cuphead. Okay.
See? Memorable name. It's a game where you're a cup as a head.
I really want to play it.
So far, it's the best question.
It's also the worst.
No, well, that's right. You guys are too clever. Anyone else have a question about this so far? You.
As an art director, what are your strategies in terms of aligning everyone's creative tendencies? Because a lot of people they have different things that they like within games, and so how do you bring that together?
Fear. Primarily. No. That's a great question, and it's really a source of a lot of stress for a lot of people thinking about collaborating with other creative people, because you do, at the end of the day, as a player, you want them to feel like, yeah, we made this, one perfect human being somehow with all these skills made this, right? But you also want to, but you just don't want to, you don't want to pick a direction to start and just like, we're doing this and no one else, it's not just about me. So I feel like that collaboration is an ongoing effort, and it's different for every team you work with, and people have different interests. There are people who really are just interested in a specialty, and they just want to be heads down and you answer questions. But there are other people who really want to be active participants. And so I think the key to that is to always communicate a lot about why you're choosing what you're choosing. When I went over those 4 Fs, part of that is you can do that early on. You can kind of talk about, like, as a group, you can get in front of a whiteboard or get some cards up and you're like, what do we want this game to be? And someone's like, well, I want it set in the 60s. And you're like, yeah, but this is a game about, computer hacking. Was that really a big thing in the 60s? And it might just turn out the person likes 60s industrial design, right? But maybe that tension leads to an unusual choice. You're like, what if it was an alternate world 60s? And then maybe that leads you down your path. So you can kind of play with that. But at the end of you have to get to a point where I think, hopefully you work the group of people who feel like you listen to them, and you take some of their ideas, but you try and say, well, this is why we're going to try this first. And I guess that's the way I always look at it. It's a series of experiments as much as you have time to iterate. We're going to try this first because I believe it answers the most questions, and it puts us further along. And then we can evaluate it. And what always happens is your initial assumptions always get improved by the great people you work with. So I think as long as you stay open and not ego-driven, it always works out. 2 questions. Can we go for a third? It's Western rule of thirds. Yes.
So in this class, we basically make a game per week.
Yes.
Our final project is we have like 4 weeks to make the game.
A luxury. 4
I
weeks.
know. So with that in mind, and also keeping in mind that I don't think a lot of us are formally trained in art, not to say that some aren't. Do you have any recommendations on doing more with less, skill-wise and time-wise?
Yes. I do understand there's probably feels a little ironic. You're like, why are we talking about all this? We're 4 weeks. I will say that a lot of these ideas, it's just analytical thinking, right? So it's a way of looking at your work and figuring out what works. Now in the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific techniques I'd recommend. But I would recommend, even with such a small time, even if all you did was take 2 hours at the start of your project, kind of run through what do we want this to look like, Certainly you probably have some reference games or reference movies or artists you might like. You might not, and that's okay too. But I think most people have a starting place, and it's worth going through that and looking at it and figuring out, like, well, why do I like this? Why is it appropriate? Is there something we can build on here? Does this work with my murder simulation? Like all the time, you'll see someone mentioned narrative dissonance earlier. You see that where people are like pick very I liked Impressionism, and then they're like, we're going to make a first-person neck stabbing game with an Impressionist palette. And you're like, that's maybe not communicating the right thing, right? And that's pretty logical when you say it out loud like that. But you might just be like, I like pastel colors. We're going to do that. So, I think it's just worth looking at it from that side. But yes, I will give you some tips about what to do. Yes. Okay, I'll continue. 4 weeks. What's interesting though is like the games that I showed you one screenshot, and we are probably maybe slightly bigger teams, but we make those games in 2 weeks, and they're all documented. So if you do want to see how we make games in 2 weeks, you can go to YouTube and look up Amnesia Fortnite. I think they're about 3 years, and you can download. I think in some cases you can download those games for free off Steam and play them, so you can see what we can accomplish in 2 weeks. All right, so let's talk about creating a visual style. And I'm going to keep in mind that you guys don't have 4 years to make a game. But that's interesting when you start talking about visuals, because mainly visuals take a lot of time, right, to get right. But where do you start? And I think if you go and look for reference on art direction and visual style, you'll see a lot of things like this, a lot of stuff that like Pixar does, right? Now this is a what's called a color script, and a color script is where they draw small thumbnails from significant scenes and put them all together, so you can kind of see what they. In the case of a movie, it's a linear medium, right? So they're trying to show you the emotional arc that is demonstrated through color. Notice, I'll point this out again, how each of these scenes has only about 3 colors in it. I'll tell you why I'm telling you that's why that's important later. You'll see a lot of this stuff. You'll see these detailed model sheets where they've drawn all the characters and all their costumes from England. You'll see, sometimes they actually make physical sculpts just for reference and inspiration of artists, not like they're actually used directly in the film. They'll storyboard out every sequence. And you know what? Like, you guys do not have time to do this, right? Like, even if you had all the artists on staff to do all this stuff, those that you were working with, you just don't have the time. And neither do I for most of my games. So what you can do is start simply. So first, this doesn't sound particularly inspiring, but it's super useful, which is just make a list of things. I can't tell you how many people I work with who don't do this. Start out, get a piece of paper, write down keywords. This is one of the lists I made when I started stacking, which was that Russian nesting doll game. But I didn't want to make it based on Russian mythology. I was inspired by Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist and the Industrial Revolution. making these poor little tiny dolls working coal mines and how terrible that was. For whatever reason, that's where my brain was at the time, and I just started writing down little vignettes and trying to find ways to put those together. But just make that list. You can pull from it later on. Even if it's only 2 weeks long, you'll get a week into it and go, oh yeah, I remember when I did that. That's useful. Let's pull from that. Do this first. And do this before you do the next step, which is find reference. Because I find that if you go and just start going to Google with that and you just like kind of click around and look for stuff, you haven't got what's personal about the game out first. Like, you got something, you got a few keywords you care about. Get that out first, and then go and look for reference. And reference can be anything. It could be, you know, screenshots from movies, it could be real-world objects, it could be other artists. But the step to make reference useful is not just to go and pull a bunch of images. Because what a lot of people do is they go and download 1,000 images in a folder, and then it's just noise, right? No one's going to look at that. You'll look at it once, you'll waste a day doing it, and you're like, oh, okay, that was helpful. What you need to do is take it a little further and make what's called a mood board in the industry, right? And the mood board is simply just an organization of a small group of those images around a particular icon or game. So these are mood boards I made for Headlander, which was primarily inspired by 1970s science fiction. And the first level of the game was supposed to be this sort of utopian pleasure palace area. So I pulled a lot of these images and put it together. And the thing that's interesting is you have to go down to just a few images. If I put 100 images on there, it wouldn't be useful. But if I put 15 images on there, that's pretty useful. You're actually making a lot of choices when you do that. And just as a snapshot, you can compare this to a mood board from the same game later in the game. This was for our moon base, the Luna Citadel, which was much more I did for Headlander when we were trying to design the outside of this. You know, and these are like, you know, these take a little time. These are like, take about a day to paint. This is another one on interior done by another artist on the team. But this isn't really probably within the scope of what you do in indie games, which you guys maybe have time to do. So do instead what I call an art jam, even if you're not artists. This is a clip from the documentary on Broken Age that you can watch. And instead, we had a lot of great artists who came and worked on the project. Some of them we contracted with. But rather than have them just like do beautiful painting and shut up, we just sat in a room and we drew for 3 days, right? We just drew simply. And here's some of those drawings. And yeah, you know, Peter Chan is an amazing artist going all the way back to early days of video gaming. But for him, this is like nothing, right? This is like mainly text if you look at it. He used, after the idea that the ship was weaving fabric and kind of really got into this particular idea. Scott Campbell, another one of our artists, drew these, right? And he's an amazing artist, but these are very, very simple. Which isn't to say it doesn't take skill, but the goal here is not to make a pretty illustration, but just to blow through as many of these ideas as you can and see if you stumble upon something that fits your game. You know, here's one that I did when we were kind of designing little outfits for the kids. And this one's a little more involved because it's color, but we had one of our artists just focus, he's a painter, so he just focused on colors more than shapes. And we kind of looked at all his palettes. But even this stuff may be outside what you guys have time to do, and so that's why this is important. And this happens all the time in the industry. It's like a hidden secret, which is you just do shitty paint overs, right? And what a paint over is a screen capture of a game, a work in progress game, that you just draw on top of from Photoshop or whatever you have, whatever. And these are used all over the place, and they're rarely publicized because they're not used in marketing because they're really rough. So let me show you some examples. So this was when we were working on Brutal Legend. This was an in-progress shot of these mines. And so I took this image and I manipulated its color in Photoshop. Right now, there's almost no painting in here. And yeah, it takes some art training, but it's just playing with colors and palettes. What we had wasn't feeling like a subterranean mine to me. And so I did some color manipulation, and I always put notes on them. I have an image without notes, an image with notes, because you're trying to communicate ideas. It's not about images as much as ideas. You're problem solving. And you're problem solving in a way much faster than modeling and putting something in a game and playing with a shader. That takes a long time. This takes no time. And you can make a million of them. You can be terrible. It doesn't matter. So here's like another one from Stacking, right? This is an early version of the game. You can see it's barely lit. There's no detail, no sense of scale. And so then I did stylize or an artist somewhere will die. Like try and break it down analytically. You guys are really clever people. I'm sure you can do that, no problem. And when you start your art tricks, start simple. Write a list of things. Get some keywords. Some reference, make some mood boards, do some shitty paint overs. That's all it's going to take. Don't imitate your inspirations. I always say it to people. But here's some resources that maybe you guys would find helpful for further study. I did mention that Pixar goes a little crazy with all their art resources, but they are still some of the best art books to look at for art process when people build a look. Most of you are familiar with these movies. You can see the kind of concept art that goes behind it. Hans Bucher is a former production designer for Disney, and this is a high-level book on art thought, art direction thought. If you at all care about color and light, this is a great thing. If you want to know a lot more about color and light than I can teach you, this is a great book on that, and you don't have to be a painter to understand it. There's an art direction doc for Headlander if you want to read how I put together an art direction document. Here's a free resource for color. If you go to this website, you can dynamically create your own palettes. You can limit it to 3 or 4 or 5 and save them out. There's a bunch up there already, so you don't have to be a color master to get something that looks good. And lastly, one last resource is that if you want to make mood boards, there's this free software called PureRef. You can download it at this URL, and it lets you drag images and rescale them and label them and make these nice, big, easy to use and present boards and share with your teams. So here's my email and Twitter if you guys would like to talk further. I know we're a little short on time, but I can take some questions hopefully in a few minutes. 1 minute of questions. Anyways, thank you for your time. Yes.
Have you ever chosen to dramatically change the art direction of a game like you did in production? And if so, how did you go about that?
I will say it has happened on games. I didn't choose it necessarily. I did mention Snowblind earlier, and yeah, so that was a game where we had to shift the look of the game because marketing was like, it can't look too Deus Ex. It's got to be more World War II shooter. So the way that I did that is using some of the remember how I said earlier that detail is costly? So I did it through lighting, and I did it through post effects. And so what we actually did is I actually got a TV and a dev unit